Welcome back this afternoon to our afternoon presentation. We have, and it's my pleasure to introduce Gerald Jordan. He's a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University, whose work focuses on how people change their lives and communities after having a mental health problem, and the factors that make such changes easier or more difficult. And he's going to talk to us today about different types of recovery. So I'm going to turn it over to him for now.
So thanks everyone for being here on I guess the final day and one of the final presentations. So it's an honor to be presenting in front of so many people given the circumstances. And today I'll be talking about some work that's based on a paper that I published I think last year on conceptual and empirical differences between clinical recovery, personal recovery, and post-traumatic growth following the first episode of psychosis. So just a heads up, I just wanted to mention that I haven't received any grant or any other associated money from pharmaceutical or private enterprise. Most of my funding has come from government sources, and I've accepted some funds from a philanthropic organization once. I just wanted to give like a heads up. So like sometimes when I talk about post-traumatic growth, like people could feel a range of different emotions. So some people could feel validated, but other people might feel guilty or feel kind of sad about things. I've gone through this myself. I remember there was one time when I was experiencing somewhat of a traumatic event, and I somehow managed to be in a post-traumatic growth talk, and I ended up leaving the talk feeling kind of like guilty because I wasn't feeling like I was growing. I was kind of depressed about things. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that you might feel a bunch of things, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a postdoc. But if you want to reach out and talk to me about how you might be feeling after listening to this presentation, I welcome any conversation or any thoughts. So I'll begin by just briefly describing what post-traumatic growth is, and it's a theoretical concept that refers to the profound, veridical, positive changes that follow an intense struggle with a traumatic or adverse experience such as psychosis. And you might hear this definition and you might be saying, well, that kind of sounds like some forms or some ways that people recover. So you might have heard of some people talking about their own recovery from a psychosis using the language of growth and self-actualization and that kind of thing. And not to anyone's surprise probably, but there have been several frameworks and studies about recovery that include growth-like processes and outcomes. So this is the Stages of Recovery instrument. So this is a framework that I think was used to develop a questionnaire or a recovery instrument. And you could see, so these authors, put together a bunch of different stages of recovery, and then the final stage of recovery here is growth, characterized by development of positive sense of self and self-actualization. And then you have, I guess, the stage model that went to inform the Chime recovery model, which I think is, a recovery model that's gained a lot of traction, was developed by Mike Slade. And, here again, it goes from, a stage of pre-contemplation all the way to a stage of maintenance and growth. So, you get a sense that as people are recovering, they're eventually, maintaining and growing and that sort of thing. So now you might be asking yourself, so if there are these similarities, how is post-traumatic growth different from recovery? And you might be wondering, maybe is recovery like an entire process of transformation in some sense? So this isn't very clear in the literature. So this is a quote from a paper by Mike Slade. He published something on post-traumatic growth in 2019. And in the conclusion section of his paper, he wrote that the relationship between mental health recovery and post-traumatic growth is unclear, as is the extent to which they are the same or overlapping but distinct phenomenon. And I apologize for the wall of text, but this was the only way that I could illustrate the point. This is just a little part of a book chapter written by the people who've created the concept of post-traumatic growth, or coined the term, Tedeschi and Calhoun. So, in this chapter, they were kind of talking about different models or concepts that kind of relate to post-traumatic growth. And then at some point they started talking about the recovery model, and they had this to say about the relationship between post-traumatic growth and recovery. Post-traumatic growth studies and treatment frameworks tend to focus on the experiences and healing processes that result from experiencing traumatic life events that challenge core beliefs. Those who have experienced the traumatic event may have assumed generally peaceful lives until they experienced a particular event. But because of their experiences, assumptive world or core beliefs are challenged, which in turn leads to cognitive processing that could foster post-traumatic growth. And then they go on to say, in the recovery model, which is what I'm sure everyone here is really familiar with, the main targets are those who deal with more chronic conditions such as schizophrenia or mental disorder. And so perhaps the two theories are distinct, even though they overlap in some way. Perhaps studies on benefit finding rather than post-traumatic growth have a closer connection with the recovery model. And that last line is the line that I find the most interesting about what they say. So benefit finding is, I guess it's a parallel model describing how people change, experience change and growth. But this model is claims that growth is more of an illusion. So there's no growth that ever occurs. It's all an illusion. It never happens. It's just people trying to convince themselves and trying to search for benefits in things that actually don't have any benefit. So they don't say this in their chapter, but when I read this, I felt like some things were implied. So the first thing that was implied was that people don't experience trauma prior to or developing an episode of psychosis, or there's no trauma related to mental disorder, as they put it. And then the second thing that seemed to be implied, again, they're not saying this, but this is what I interpret, is that growth experienced by people with mental disorder, as they call it, experience something closer to benefit finding rather than an actual growth process. So what I felt was, they're arguing that there's growth for the majority of the population, but people with mental disorders, they don't get to experience growth. They just search for benefits and, never grow from their experiences. So that's kind of what I was, what I read in that statement. And so why is this important? So, I mean, right now, the field of post-traumatic growth, looking at psychosis and mental disorders, as they would put it, is still kind of small. But over the last 10 years or so, there's been kind of an uptick in interest in the concept. So, I've published a little bit on the topic. But then you have, David Rowe, who's done some work in this, Mike Slade, and they're like super cool and important recovery researchers. So this might be something that ends up getting some traction in the future beyond what it is today. I guess on the practical level, it's important because people with their living experience of psychosis or other challenges are often denied the opportunity to create their own meaning around their experiences. And then post-traumatic growth is one, or seeing growth in your experiences or experiencing growth in your experiences could be like one form of meaning. And so telling a service provider within a clinical context that you might have grown in some way, oftentimes people, when they state things like this, are told you obviously don't have any insight, or this must be a symptom, you're delusional, or whatever stuff, whatever kind of stuff bad psychiatrists or clinicians would say. And this is like based on conversations that I've had with a lot of people. And then a third important point is, if we know more about, I guess if we could strengthen theory around post-traumatic growth and see how it's distinct from recovery, then maybe we could just support future research on post-traumatic growth in the area of psychosis. Another reason why this is important is because I generally see the influence of what, a lot of people have called toxic positivity, being co-opting work on post-traumatic growth, and, kind of a culture of toxic positivity changing the way that post-traumatic growth was intended to be kind of implemented in settings to just be something a little bit different. So, I've seen instances where there have been post-traumatic growth interventions in work settings where, the emphasis is on making, encouraging employees to just see all the good and all the stress that they're experiencing at work. And there's no attention paid to the fact that, they don't have any, unions are being dismantled, or, can't disconnect from work anymore. You're constantly bombarded by emails and text messages from your, coworkers and that sort of thing. So that's the toxic positivity thing that's gone on in other areas of post-traumatic growth. And so it's this topic is important because it's I just think it's important that we don't let that kind of thing slip into this work right now. And then again, this answering this question could help provide lessons on how not to conduct research on and support post-traumatic growth among people in crisis. So given that, the topic of, the outline of my presentation is up here, and I'll just I'll go over what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to just briefly go over how they're defined and conceptualized, both post-traumatic growth and recovery. I'll briefly go over the historical origins of both concepts, as well as their prevalence, how they're subjectively experienced, and their correlates / predictors within a sample of among a sample of people that I gave questionnaires and conducted interviews with, and then I'll just go over some of their common trappings. So I kind of described what post-traumatic growth was during one of my first slides, but I'll just rehash it again. It refers to the profound, veridical, and positive psychological changes that follow an intense struggle with a traumatic or adverse experience. And what's important to keep in mind about post-traumatic growth is that it often occurs among just a lot of despair, a lot of sadness, a lot of suffering, and it's important to acknowledge the suffering that people are experiencing when we're talking about post-traumatic growth. This is something that the authors of the post-traumatic growth concept make very clear, and it's the concept is, I guess, rooted in questions such as how do we make meaning out of suffering, and what could we do with our suffering. And where can we go from where we're suffering? And post-traumatic growth is generally occurs in at least 5 domains. So in addition to experiencing a lot of suffering following trauma or adversity, people might come to appreciate their lives more. They might describe having experienced improved relationships with other people, or shedding toxic relationships with people they no longer want to associate with. Some people describe feeling like stronger and more authentic with who they are after experiencing adversity. They might identify new life possibilities for themselves, and they might also grow at a spiritual or religious or existential level. And again, so some people are, after an adversity such as psychosis, are completely transformed by their experiences, and they experience all these different domains of growth. But what often is the case is that, some people will just, they'll be, suffering tremendously, but they might reflect on, where they've come from and where they are, and they might be like, well, I really appreciate every day right now, and or I really love my mother, or something like that, And so what I'm trying to say is, post-traumatic growth could be completely transformative, or it could just be like a little sliver of something within the darkness that often follows adversities for quite a long time. This is a general model of, a summary model of how post-traumatic growth occurs, and I didn't want to go through how the whole process of it, but I just wanted to show you that there's kind of a lot of arrows. If you're familiar with a lot of cognitive psychology work, they like to show things using arrows and these processes, and with these boxes and things, and Another thing that I wanted to illustrate was, how the authors of the post-traumatic growth concept describe it occurring as it's kind of like a psychological process involving like coping, different forms of rumination, and that sort of thing. And like, as all these different psychological processes unfold within the context of severe emotional distress that usually accompanies what's going on, then people experience post-traumatic growth. So now I'll describe a little bit about about the topic of recovery. So, I work with Larry Davidson, and he's always told me about how there's all kinds of definitions of recovery, and it's kind of confusing. And so one of the ways that he kind of like tried to make sense of, I guess, all the variation in how recovery was defined is he defined it as recovery could be people could be recovered from like a mental health challenge, which could reflect kind of like how you would heal from a broken bone. So people who are in recovery from a psychosis could perhaps no longer be experiencing hallucinations or beliefs that others might not share. But then for people who are still experiencing some of these things, then another form of recovery might be more appropriate. So being in recovery. So, and that being in recovery kind of reflects how we kind of find a way to live a meaningful life despite the experiences that we still might be feeling. Another way of breaking down all the variation and definitions of recovery was developed by Mike Slade, who and his team, who developed the concepts of personal recovery. So what does recovery mean to people themselves? And clinical recovery, which means reflects what clinicians think about recovery. And recovery from mental illness kind of fits within the clinical recovery definition, and being in recovery kind of fits within the personal recovery definition of, that I just spoke of. And there's some okay evidence showing that personal recovery and clinical recovery are kind of associated or linked. And I think there's actually a new paper in Schizophrenia Bulletin showing, I think, that personal recovery is the clinical recovery predicts personal recovery, or personal recovery is dependent on clinical recovery, something along those lines. And as I alluded to earlier, there's these self-actualizing versions of recovery that people describe, and which are embedded in some models. This is a pretty common definition of recovery that I'm sure many of you have referred before, put forth by Anthony. So recovery is a deeply personal, unique process of changing one's attitudes, values, feelings, goals, skills, and roles. It's a way of living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life, even within the limitations caused by illness. Recovery involves the development of new meaning and purpose in one's life as one grows beyond the catastrophic events of mental illness. And this, kind of fits within the personal recovery definition of recovery. So, I showed you earlier, like, how post-traumatic growth kind of unfolds through this psychological process. Well, recovery is kind of situated within a social model of disability, which is one of the differences between the two. So at the center of the recovery process is the person, what the person is doing, but then to support recovery, people rely on, having a house, an income, education, work, recovery-oriented mental health services, friends and family, and that sort of thing. And then this is like one of the most popular recovery models out there, reflecting personal recovery. It's the Chime Framework. So this is based on a review of many studies on recovery, and then the authors kind of put it all together to make sense of what it all meant. And so in this model, recovery involves connectedness, hope and optimism, identity, meaning, and empowerment. So now I'll move on to I showed you kind of like how the definitions and the conceptual models of recovery and post-traumatic growth are different, and now I'll move on to show you how the history of both of these things are kind of different. So briefly, the story of post-traumatic growth is very old. You could just read any ancient text and you'll see a story about how people are redeemed from suffering. You think about Jesus dying on the cross and how it's described in the Bible. And so the concept actually has very, very ancient roots. So that said, it's, the authors of the post-traumatic growth concept talk about how post-traumatic growth is rooted in religious and spiritual thought, but also in existential and humanistic psychology. One person who's particularly important in this regard is Frankl, who wrote, a lot about meaning making within the Nazi concentration camp. In addition, cognitive psychology, as you could see, played an important role. I wanted to highlight that both Jung described the process of individuation, of becoming, your own person. This is separate. This is a history that's separate from that of post-traumatic growth, but it's something that's important within the body of work on psychosis. And these two, I guess, traditions never really spoke, but I think it's just important to highlight. So there's Jung who talked about the process of individuation, and then John Weir Perry, who I'm sure a lot of people know about, studied under Jung and advanced his ideas further to talk about how psychosis could be kind of like a catalyst for the individuation process, and could push people to become more authentic and that kind of thing. And then, as I alluded to earlier, the post-traumatic growth concept has been kind of increasingly co-opted by this toxic positivity that I mentioned earlier. And what I've noticed also is that a lot of people with lived experience of different types of mental health challenges are doing a lot of work on post-traumatic growth. So they're kind of like bringing the future of the concept forward. And then briefly, the history of recovery is, different from that of post-traumatic growth. So, it's rooted in the work of Pinel, the psychiatric survivor movement, longitudinal studies showing that people could do better over time with the schizophrenia diagnosis, as well as in survivor-led research and recovery narratives. Over time in the 2000s, you start to see like a shift of mental health services to try and embrace the vision for recovery-oriented systems of care. And kind of like, I guess, the post-traumatic growth concept, you also see this, co-optation of the concept by, toxic, or maybe not toxic positive psychology, but positive psychology, and, the general forces of neoliberalism. So if you go on the website of Recovery in the Bin, which is, a great, they're a great organization, they have a lot to say about how neoliberalism is kind of like, reduced what recovery was supposed to mean from what its roots were, and kind of like an attempt to reconcile what recovery was supposed to be with where it's kind of headed now because of being co-opted. Larry Davidson and Michael Rowe at the Yale Program of Community Health have kind of advanced the idea of recovering citizenship. So the idea of advancing how people could recover their sense of belonging and place within their communities. So now that I've showed you the kind of different histories, I'll move on to one of the final parts of this presentation, which will be to discuss some findings, some data that I collected while I was doing my PhD. So what I did was I gave some questionnaires and I did some interviews with people at a specialized early intervention program for psychosis. So this was a catchment area based service. So everybody who had experienced the psychosis within a certain like geographical area of the city were encouraged to go there if they felt that they wanted to go there. It's not entirely representative. Like we don't have a really good estimate of how many people actually go to the service, but an estimate from a similar like area in Canada where I'm from showed that maybe roughly 60% of people who ever experience a psychosis end up going to these types of services. So just wanted to highlight that. I gave questionnaires to 94 people and I interviewed 12 people. And as you could see from the demographics that I've displayed here, they're kind of similar to what you'd expect to see in other specialized early intervention services. So this is the first graph that I'll show you. This is so I gave a questionnaire measuring people's total amount of post-traumatic growth that they experienced after their first episode of psychosis. And so this graph represents their total amount of growth across all the domains. And you could see that, you have some people that experience, or report experiencing very little growth. And then you have people that are report experiencing a lot of growth, but then most of the people are kind of in the middle over here, which, I worked in a mainstream psychiatry for a long time. And so this finding was very, very surprising to be into a lot of people working in psychiatry. And then this graph kind of parallels the rates of personal recovery that people kind of reported experiencing. So this is data from the total, all total scores on what's called the recovery assessment scale, which is like a very, very commonly used measure of personal recovery. And here again, you could see that, some people don't really report experiencing high levels of personal recovery. You have some people that are reporting a lot of it, but then most people are kind of in the middle. And then finally, this is just data showing levels of clinical recovery. So I wasn't able to, measure both functioning and remission from symptoms, which is how clinical recovery is often defined among people because of limitations in the data. But I'm showing you here like rates of positive symptom remission and in the sample, negative symptom remission, and people in total remission. This is again out of a sample of 94 people. And then here is people's average global assessment of functioning scale scores, which reflects mild symptoms or difficulty in occupational social functioning, but generally performing well. So yeah, this is not actually data that I collected. So this is data that some researchers at the service had collected, and I was able to match the data that I collected from those earlier questionnaires with this data to see what some of the differences and similarities are in the data. And then what I did was I tried to see if there were any correlations between post-traumatic growth and personal recovery and any of the symptoms, symptom remission and people's global assessment of functioning. And what I found was that post-traumatic growth had a strong correlation with personal recovery. So this meant that if you see they might be the same thing, or maybe like personal recovery depends on post-traumatic growth, or maybe the other way around. But you kind of just see people, you kind of see people who are experiencing post-traumatic growth and people experiencing personal recovery, kind of, those two things are happening at the same time. But that's not the case with the symptoms stuff. So what it shows is that post-traumatic growth doesn't really have much to do with symptoms, and it doesn't really have much to do with whether someone's functioning according to the psychiatric scale that I described earlier. And then I wanted to kind of delve a little deeper and see what aspects of post-traumatic growth kind of correlated with aspects of the personal recovery scale. So here, again, these are all the domains of post-traumatic growth on this side. And these are all the domains of personal recovery up here. And you could see that all these stars represent significant correlations. I don't want to confuse or overwhelm everyone with like all kinds of numbers. But I just wanted to share that all these domains were correlated, except for the domains of spiritual growth and reliance on others. So people who experience spiritual growth perhaps didn't really rely on others during their recovery process. And I think this points to how maybe people who are experiencing spiritual change might not feel comfortable sharing that with other people because there's a lot of stigma around spirituality among people who experience, psychosis. So when I asked people about how they changed, the types of post-traumatic growth that they experienced, they described like a bunch of different areas of growth. So first of all, they described how they experienced declines and difficulties after their psychosis, but they also described experiencing improved sense of they felt healthier, they felt stronger at the level of their cells, and they experienced improved personality, stronger, more balanced spirituality and religiosity, improved relationships with others, improved lifestyles, new goals and expectations for the future. And again, not everybody was completely transformed by their experience of psychosis. Most people were suffering to a great extent. Some people were, experienced just a couple of these things. Some people experienced more of this than others. And it's, there's a lot of variation in that. And all these changes that people described experiencing reflected either fundamental shifts in how they were before, so that these were totally different ways of experiencing their lives compared to how they were before their psychosis. But then for others, these changes kind of seem to represent attempts for them to kind of reconnect with how they were before their psychosis ever happened. So with how they were as kids, or kind of attempts to solve problems that they felt might have precipitated the psychosis to begin with. So, for instance, some people who were part of cults or had toxic, abusive relationships with abusive partners found ways to shed those relationships and felt like their relationships had improved in substantial ways. And this is a quote illustrating, this post-traumatic growth that people described experiencing. And I think that who I am and my sense of self right now is somebody who is a lot more confident, is a lot stronger, and values everything that makes my life possible a lot more than I used to. Because now I know what the alternative is. And the alternative is having constant doubts as to whether or not I deserve to exist based off the depression that came up. And that means that if I didn't want to be here, I wouldn't be here. So I should have that mentality going into everything that I do. And then this person said, I'm very active in feminist scenes. I don't think I could understand the experience of other survivors unless I was one myself. And a vast majority of my abuse comes from this other world. And I feel like without those experiences, without that kind of rough hardening, I would be very oblivious, or I would only have a textbook theoretical perspective on what a lot of women go through. And that means that I'd be speaking to another place of privilege. And so when I asked people about how what recovery meant to them and where they were along their process of recovery, people talked about their recovery as reflecting a return to normality, being able to once again engage in meaningful activities, being symptom-free, back at school. One person talked about how it wasn't up to her to say if she was recovered or not, it was up to her doctor. Some people talked about recovery being linked to positive change and growth. And then some people also talked about how recovery just didn't make sense as a concept for them. And so these are two quotes from the people that I spoke to about what they thought about recovery. So one person said, I don't know what it means anymore because there's no, like someone said, like there's a new normal kind of, like there's no going back to normal because like there's no way back. It's just moving forward and finding the new way that I am and accepting the new way that I am, which again, here sounds a lot like post-traumatic growth. And then another person said, yeah, I'm not really going to recover and I don't really want to go back to where I was before at all. Because like it didn't work out for me, work out very well for me where I was headed. So finally, I wanted to see what kind of correlates with post-traumatic growth, personal recovery, and symptom remission. And again, here I used data that was collected at the service, and I tried to match that data with what I had collected. And what you could see here is that, so symptom remission is kind of correlated with these kind of typical, variables that psychiatry studies kind of tend to measure a lot of. So how long someone was experiencing psychosis before they came to the service, levels of anxiety, whether they were female or not, that kind of was related to symptom remission. But that wasn't really the case for post-traumatic growth and personal recovery. So those types of things didn't really matter as much or at all. What mattered for those two experiences was having social support from people from their families and their loved ones. So to conclude, what I think all this means, and what I hope I was able to illustrate, is that personal recovery is a broader construct that an experience that may include growth-like processes, and post-traumatic growth reflects a more narrow construct and experience. Post-traumatic growth is not very related to clinical outcomes, if at all, but it's related to like personal recovery. And that recovery is embedded within a social model of disability, and that post-traumatic growth is expected to flow from these psychological processes. So, I just wanted to like highlight a couple things. So, there's been a lot of a couple papers in the literature talking about some misuses and abuses of the recovery concept. I talked a little bit about, my worry about toxic positivity, kind of like shaping work on post-traumatic growth. So I just wanted to highlight some concluding precautions to future research or future, anything in this area. So, I mean, fundamentally, I think we need to think about if we're going to conduct interventions or help people experience post-traumatic growth in any setting, I think there really needs to be some care around we need to think about the ethics of how that should come about. So who would this be for? What's, we just need to plan this a little bit. Because I think a lot of people could feel hurt and left out or re-traumatized by being expected to grow or something like that, if they're just not interested or ready or for a number of other reasons. It's also important that that we don't neglect suffering, at both the personal level and also suffering that's rooted within broader social and political factors. So, the post-traumatic growth model, as I showed earlier, is kind of unfolds through the psychological processes, but it's important to keep in mind the social and the political and the economic elements that sustain people and also harm people. Larry Davidson and Mike Slade have talked about how, if people are expected to be able to recover, then we don't have to fund services that support recovery anymore. So, I have an intense fear that if some neoliberal policymaker finds out that, well, people could actually grow from their psychosis, well, we don't have to do anything anymore. Well, that's, please, I'm pretty sure no one in here is one of those types of people, but, this is not something that I endorse or that should be endorsed in the future. And again, it's important that we don't create expectations that everyone should be growing all the time, or we can't make room for the chaos narrative that a lot of people experience but feel like they can't really bring to their lives. So I just hope that this work doesn't really contribute to that. And yeah, there's more I could talk about this, but yeah. And then I guess the last question that I had on my mind was, which is a better theory, post-traumatic growth or recovery? Like, obviously, I've done a lot of research on post-traumatic growth, but I do feel like, in the interest of people and where they might want to go, post-traumatic growth is a little bit too specific, and, it could be harmful. A lot of people feel like the recovery concept has become harmful. But yeah, a lot of people could feel like sad because they're not experiencing growth to any extent, and we have to be mindful of that, and so it might be better to have like a broad theory like recovery that captures broader experiences and could support more diverse people and experiences. I also think recovery is kind of better because post-traumatic growth is more individual focused rather than recovery, which is embedded within a social model. Yeah, and then I guess within the whole work on post-traumatic growth, there just hasn't been a lot of pushback, as much pushback on, the forces of neoliberalism, capitalism, that sort of thing, as there is within, the critique of the recovery model right now, which I think is important. So with that, I think I'm done.